Matthew, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to present in our forum today. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I assume you're all seeing the shared screen. I'm going to share it for only a short time because I don't really like looking at a shared screen. So I'll keep it up just to convey to you the general structure of the talk, and then I'll stop sharing. Let me first say, however, in context of this sort, it's quite common for a speaker to begin by expressing regret that the talk is being delivered through Zoom rather than in person. I don't harbor any such regret, I must admit. I enjoy being in Oxford whenever I'm there, but at the same time, Zoom is clearly more convenient in many respects. And right now, while I'm in the midst of these tasks of proofreading and indexing, I would not be able to put aside the time to go to Oxford. So I don't myself feel any compunctions about delivering this talk through Zoom. All right, well, the talk, of course, is based on the paper which has been circulated. I realize that not everyone will have read the paper. It's quite short, but I was subject to it's being published in Philosophy and Social Criticism, and they impose a limit of 6,000 words. So it's really short and in some respects quite compressed. This talk, given the 30-minute limit, will also have to be compressed. And indeed, I'm not going to include this section on justifications at all. But I will begin with a remark on something that isn't in the paper, that is what moral absoluteness is. And then I'll move on briefly to explain what the absolute principle of freedom of expression is, the moral principle of freedom of expression is, and then go through the different types of neutrality that are required under that principle. And I should emphasize at the outset that these types of neutrality are different from the neutrality which Rawlsians speak about when they insist on neutrality among reasonable conceptions of the good. I have discussed that latter type of neutrality at length in the first 4 chapters of my 2017 book, Liberalism with Excellence. But that's not what I'm discussing here. I'm discussing a distinctive set of types of neutrality here, which Rawlsians would largely endorse, but it's not what they're talking about when they oppose perfectionism on neutralist grounds. All right, so that, and as I say, I'm going to omit part 4 here, so I won't include that bit. Now, since the outline is so skimpy here, I don't think I need to keep it up for the whole talk on a shared screen, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and move back into the full screen, which I find much more congenial. And let me start then with a word on what I mean when I talk about moral absolutes. When I talk about the absoluteness of a moral principle, I mean that it is exceptionless, that there are no exceptions to it, that it is binding always and everywhere, that its requirements are always and everywhere applicable, and there are no exceptions to those requirements. Now, there are 2 types of absoluteness that I discuss in some of my previous books, including this book, Freedom of Expression as Self-Restraint, though it's not in the paper, which some of you have read at all. But in this book, it is discussed. And that is weak absoluteness versus strong absoluteness. When I talk about absoluteness as exceptionlessness, I'm talking about what I call weak absoluteness. Absoluteness as exceptionlessness, absoluteness as the property of being always and everywhere binding. Strong absoluteness, as the label suggests, is a stronger type of absoluteness. That is, it consists not only in exceptionlessness, but also in being more stringent than any other moral requirements that might come into conflict with it. So if a moral requirement is strongly absolute, then not only is it always and everywhere binding, but it is also more stringent than any other moral requirement that might come into conflict with it. And when I talk about the principle of freedom of expression as absolute, I am talking about it as weakly absolute. I don't claim that it is strongly absolute. Now, what then is what I call the principle of freedom of expression, this moral principle? And as an absolute, what is it? Well, it obviously doesn't consist in the proposition that modes of expression or types of communicative activity can never properly be restricted or disadvantaged by systems of governance. That would be an absurd principle. As far as I know, such a principle has never been espoused by anyone. And so that's not the principle that I'm characterizing as absolute here. The principle that I'm defending here is the principle that no system of governance can ever legitimately prohibit or otherwise restrict any mode of communicative activity as a mode of communicative activity rather than as a mode of communication independent misconduct. And that, therefore, that statement of the principle obliges me to explain what I mean by communication independent misconduct, which is where the paper opens. The short paper that's been circulated opens with this. So I'm now just going through the paper. And communication independent misconduct, as I specify it there and in my book at much greater length, would be a mode of misconduct that can be perpetrated either through communicative activities or through non-communicative activities. And so it's not distinctively communicative misconduct. And it's therefore communication independent in precisely that sense. That is, that it can be perpetrated either communicatively or non-communicatively. And the fact that someone has perpetrated that mode of misconduct doesn't indicate in itself one way or the other whether the person's perpetration has been communicative or non-communicative. So to take an easy example, which isn't in the paper, though I presented in my book, suppose that a gang of bank robbers elect to perpetrate a bank robbery, and some of them, they assign the tasks to one another, and one of them has the distinctive task of watching for the police and communicating to his fellow robbers in the bank that the fact that the police are coming when they do arrive. And so this member of the gang has a distinctively communicative role in the perpetration of the robbery. The only part that he plays is communicative, and so his participation in this robbery of the bank is communicative, but the category of wrongdoing, that is bank robbing, is communication independent, because one's participation in it can be either communicative, as in the instance of the member of this gang whom I mentioned, or more often non-communicative in going into the bank and holding a gun or whatever it may be. And so it's not a distinctively communicative mode of misconduct, robbing a bank, even though someone can participate in that mode of misconduct communicatively. And so it's a communication independent mode of misconduct, and therefore the member of the gang who has served as a lookout, who has watched out for the arrival of the police and then communicated that arrival, he can be prosecuted and subjected to sanctions along with every other member of the gang. And that's not at all in contravention of the principle of freedom of expression. And so that's an example of what I have in mind when I talk about a communication independent mode of misconduct. It is of course not to say that no communication is involved in what that member of the gang has done. It's just to say that the mode of misconduct he has committed is communication independent. Now, the principle of freedom of expression, which disallows any governmental measures directed against modes of communication as modes of communication rather than as modes of communication independent misconduct, requires certain types of neutrality. And these types of neutrality are discussed, most of the paper that's been circulated is devoted to an exposition of these types of neutrality. And so I'm going to go through them briefly here. Given the constraint of time, that's all I'll have time to do in this presentation. But so the first type is the most general type, and indeed it comprehends the other types. But I still think that it is appropriate to characterize it separately, because although a contravention of any of the other types of neutrality will also be a contravention of this first type, there is no converse relationship. That is, someone can contravene this first type of neutrality without contravening any one of the others. So the first type is what I'm calling communication neutrality. And communication neutrality is really just targeting or directing a measure against a mode of communicative conduct as a mode of communicative conduct, rather than as a communication independent mode of misconduct. And there are major distinctions and doctrines in American constitutional law which are aimed at disallowing any contravention of this type of neutrality. Now, one thing I emphasize in my book, I don't so much emphasize this in the paper, though I think it's apparent in the paper, but in my book, I repeatedly emphasize that my discussion of the principle of freedom of expression is not a contribution to American constitutional theory. I am not an American constitutional lawyer. I know a lot about American constitutional law inevitably. I am an American. I did study at an American law school, but I'm not an American constitutional lawyer, and my book is a book of philosophy, not of constitutional theory. Nonetheless, the First Amendment to the American Constitution, and in particular the clause in the First Amendment that provides for freedom of speech or freedom of expression, has been such a rich source of discussions and distinctions and doctrines pertaining to freedom of expression that it would be crazy for any philosopher to ignore all that rich repository of materials. And so in virtually every philosophical discussion of freedom of expression, there are remarks made on various doctrines and distinctions in American constitutional law. And so that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to make reference to a few of those distinctions, but I want to emphasize that I'm making references to them as illustrative rather than because I'm trying to contribute to American constitutional theory. So one of these famous discussions in Oliver Wendell Holmes's first major opinion, a majority opinion in this case, though he became much more famous for writing dissents subsequently. But in his first main judgment, Oliver Wendell Holmes discussed a malicious shout by someone in a crowded theater. Of course, at the time Holmes presented this, much of the lighting was still non-electrical. But even today, with electrical lighting, there would be a serious danger that shouting fire in a crowded theater would give rise to a panic and would induce a serious public disturbance, a serious public disorder in which people were likely to be injured or killed, and in which there would be serious damage to property and so forth. And so this malicious shout of fire in a dark and crowded theater was what Holmes was adducing as an instance of communicative activity that could clearly be justly proscribed. And although Holmes wasn't making exactly the point that I'm making, I nonetheless would take over, as so many other philosophers of freedom of expression have taken over, this example to illustrate that, that a prohibition on inducing serious public disorder or inducing or seeking to induce a serious public disturbance is a communication independent prohibition. It's not aimed distinctively at communicative instances or types of such a wrong. It is aimed at that wrong generally, the wrong of inducing or seeking to induce a dangerous public disturbance. And that sort of prohibition then is impeccably in keeping with the principle of freedom of expression. It is not directed against the malicious shout of fire as a communicative mode of conduct. It's directed against the malicious shout of fire as a communication independent mode of misconduct. And so Holmes's example, though adduced for a slightly different, though closely related purpose, is nonetheless well illustrative of this first type of neutrality that I'm talking about, the most general type. Likewise, the distinction drawn by the 1969 Brandenburg v. Ohio judgment of the US Supreme Court is, I think, perfectly in line with this type of neutrality. The distinction is between incitement and advocacy. And now proponents of hate speech legislation like to attack the Brandenburg judgment, whereas I extol it. I think it is one of the fountainheads of the philosophy of freedom of expression, in the sense that it perfectly captures, in my view, the circumstances in which certain fulminations constitute communication independent misconduct, as opposed to fulminations that are distinctively communicative in their wrongness. And many of you will be aware, either through my paper or independently, many of you will be aware that the Brandenburg court in 1969 laid down three main requirements that have to be met if a mode of invective is to be properly classifiable as incitement rather than as advocacy. And those three requirements are that the mode of invective has to be aimed at inducing serious serious wrongdoing, serious communication independent wrongdoing, such as a lynching or a riot or some such mode of misconduct. It has to be uttered in circumstances where the occurrence of that misconduct, in part as a result of the incitement, is likely, and where that occurrence is imminent. And so the intentionality, the likelihood, and the imminence are the three main requirements imposed by the Brandenburg court. And that judgment remains good law to this day. So again, I'm not aimed at providing an account of American constitutional law here, but on that point, not on some other points, but on that point, American constitutional law is in keeping with the principle of freedom of expression, because I think when those three requirements are satisfied, the fulminations that are being classified under them as incitement are properly perceived as the opening stage or stages of the serious wrongdoing which the incitement serves to bring about. So whether it's a lynching, whether it's a riot, whether it's serious vandalism, whatever the wrongdoing may be that the incitement has served to instigate, it can properly be classified as one of the opening stages of that incitement. That is, it constitutes the speaker's participation in that mode of misconduct, the communication independent mode of misconduct. A speaker can participate in a riot or a lynching by bringing it about through incitement of this sort. And so the speaker's participation would be the opening stage of whatever occurs or whatever the speaker has sought to make occur. And again, then, I think the US Supreme Court has appropriately put its finger on what is required under the doctrine of communication neutrality, which is imposed by the moral principle of the freedom of expression. And so although I diverge from American constitutional law on some other points, which I won't discuss in this talk, on the points I'm discussing here, I think that American constitutional law, in contrast with the laws that exist in almost all European states, including the United Kingdom, is in keeping with the principle of freedom of expression. I can just see that Kate wants to ask a question on communication neutrality, and you'll get your chance. Okay, so let me move on then quickly to the other types of neutrality. There are two types of content neutrality, which I discuss in the paper and at much greater length in my book, and which I'll recount briefly here. One of them is subject neutrality, and the other is viewpoint neutrality. And so these are requirements under the principle of freedom of expression that no system of governance ever disadvantage or discriminate against modes of communicative activity by reference to the subjects discussed or by reference to the viewpoints espoused, where the reference to the subject discussed or the reference to the viewpoints espoused is not a way of indicating what mode of communication independent misconduct is constituted by the communicative utterance. And so let's take an example here, which I present both in my book. In my book, I present many examples, but here I will discuss only the example that's included in the paper, where this requirement of subject neutrality is contravened. So suppose that a municipality operates a network of buses, of local buses, and the officials in the municipality elect to make the sides and backs of the buses available to potential advertisers, but they impose a certain restriction that no advertisement pertaining to abortion or no advertisement pertaining to immigration will be accepted for posting on the sides and backs of the buses. Well, that's a subject-specific restriction. It doesn't specify any viewpoint, so all viewpoints are excluded alike, but the what it does do is to specify a certain subject or set of subjects that will be off limits from what has become a public forum, a forum for the posting of advertisements. And that's a contravention of the principle of freedom of expression, even though, as I argue in my book, a municipality could legitimately decide to exclude advertisements altogether from the sides and backs of its buses. I present a rationale for this, but in my book, but I won't go into it here. I'll simply state that a municipality could permissibly exclude advertisements altogether. What it can't permissibly do is to impose a subject-specific restriction of the sort that I've just mentioned. Viewpoint neutrality is similar in these respects, in that a municipality, staying with this example of the local buses, a municipality could elect to exclude advertisements altogether, but what it can't permissibly do is to impose a viewpoint-specific restriction. Suppose that the municipality disallows any advertisements that are inconsistent with the policies of the UK Labour Party, or suppose that it disallows any advertisements that are on the pro-choice side of the abortion controversy, rather than on the so-called pro-life side. Well, that either of those restrictions is clearly targeted against a certain viewpoint or set of viewpoints, and is therefore, again, at odds with the principle of freedom of expression as violative of content neutrality and specifically of viewpoint neutrality. And in my book, and in a very compressed fashion at the end of my paper, I argue at length that these fine-grained restrictions, these fine-grained prohibitions, can be morally worse than more sweeping restrictions in some contexts, and in particular in the context that I'm envisaging here. That is, as I've said, I think that a local government could legitimately exclude advertisements altogether from the sides and backs of its buses. There could be perfectly good communication independent reasons for adopting such a policy. But what it can't permissibly do is to impose a content specific, and whether it's subject specific or viewpoint specific restriction, because any restriction of that sort is violative of the principle of freedom of expression. And in my book, I explain at some length why this fine-grained sort of restriction is morally problematic in this context, even though a more sweeping restriction could be morally legitimate. Right, the final type of neutrality I will discuss here is what I call speaker neutrality. And this would be a type of neutrality focused on the identity of a given individual or group who would seek to communicate in a given context. And this type of neutrality is obviously quite closely similar to viewpoint neutrality, but it is not equivalent to viewpoint neutrality. That is, for example, the expression of any point of view on a certain issue could be allowed, even though a particular individual would not be allowed to speak publicly on that issue. And a classic example of this, which I mention in my paper as well as at greater length in my book, was the situation in the United Kingdom. Most of you are attending this talk are too young to remember this, but I remember it. I'm certainly not too young to remember this situation. I remember it very well from the late 1980s, I think it was 1988, to the mid 1990s, I think it was 1994. So for a period of about 6 years in the United Kingdom, throughout the United Kingdom, the broadcasters, BBC and other broadcasters, were prohibited from airing the voices of terrorists on either side of the conflict in Northern Ireland, and also voices from some specified political parties, mainly Sinn Féin, though also a couple of extreme Protestant parties in Northern Ireland. So the viewpoints of these people, and indeed their very words, could be aired because the BBC and other broadcasters were legally allowed to hire actors with Northern Irish accents who would imitate these people. But what they weren't allowed to do was to put on the air, either the radio or television, these people themselves. They couldn't put on their voices. They couldn't allow them to appear on television. And so this was a classic example of a speaker-specific restriction, because as I've said, actors could be hired to read out the words of these people, which they had uttered in interviews or in other public settings. So it wasn't their viewpoints that were being excluded at all. It was purely their individual appearances that were being excluded. So that's a classic example of a speaker-specific restriction. And that type of restriction, again, is violative of the principle of freedom of expression, just as each of the any contravention of any of these other types of neutrality is a contravention of the principle of freedom of expression. And that's because in each case, the contravention is directed against some mode of communication, not as a communication independent form of misconduct, but instead as an instance of communication. And so those types of neutrality are the main corollaries of the principle of freedom of expression. If I had time, I'd go into a matter of justification that is very briefly discussed in the paper, but I don't have time, so I will stop there.